From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Donald Trump muses about potential tax policies he'd pursue in a second term, including making tips tax-free and possibly replacing the personal income tax with tariffs. Is any of this a good idea? How likely is it to come to pass? And how does it compare with the policies favored by the incumbent President Biden? Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We are joined today by my colleagues, editorial board member Kate Batchelder-Odell and columnist Kim Strassel. Despite a presidential election that is now only 20 weeks away, we are still having a campaign, at least to my eye, that is based on the past and on personalities rather than the future and any agenda for the country. Though now bits and pieces of ideas seem to be breaking through now and again. And one of those in recent weeks has been Donald Trump's idea of making tips tax-free. Here's the man himself, Donald Trump, announcing this idea at a Las Vegas rally.
So this is the first time I've said this, and for those hotel workers and people that get tips, you're going to be very happy, because when I get to office, we are going to not charge taxes on tips, people making tips. We're not going to do it. And we're going to do that right away, first thing in office, because it's been a point of contention for years and years and years. And you do a great job of service. You take care of people. And I think it's going to be something that really is deserved. More importantly, popular or unpopular. I do some unpopular things, too, if it's right for the country. I do what's right. But so those people that have jobs in restaurants, whatever the job may be, a tipping job, we're not going after for taxes anymore. This will be ended.
Kate, what do you make of this idea on the substance and the politics? I have to say it sounded like a lot of cheers there in Las Vegas for tax-free tips.
Well, Donald Trump is certainly playing here to the folks in Vegas who rely on tips, people who work at hotels, people who work at restaurants. This is quite clearly a pure play to win some of these voters. Now, let me back up and say, I think there is a directional difference between Trump and Biden and what they're proposing on taxes. And with Trump's 2017 tax cuts, with many of those provisions expiring at the end of 2025, the tax burden really is on the ballot, so voters should think about it. And Biden wants to increase taxes on corporations, on individuals, on capital gains. I mean, there's a number of tax increases that Biden is interested in. And Trump is at least talking largely about going directionally lower, even if there are some exceptions like tariffs. Now, let me say, though, this is just terrible tax policy. Exempting tips is basically a special carve out for some workers over others. And you don't want to run the tax code that way. You want to raise as much revenue as possible while doing the least amount of damage. And the obvious problem with it, Kyle, is that people, as they always do when the tax code changes, they'll reorganize their income to take advantage of the tax break. It's a huge tax preference for tips. I mean, think about if you are a waiter working at a high-end steakhouse in New York and how much of your compensation is in tips. It's enormous. So you have to do this through Congress. You'd have a lot of rent seeking about what industries could end up being covered. I mean, tips are under both payroll and income tax. Some industries would try to get in on it so they could make more of their workers tipped employees. So you'd create possibly new categories, entirely new categories of tipped workers. And if you're like me and you've been out recently and you've bought a cup of coffee and had an iPad turned toward you and been offered to tip and you're not sure if you should, I mean, we could be talking about largely expanding the tipped universe in a ways I don't see voters clamoring for. So again, I think this is a sop that plays to trying to buy votes, which is regrettable. And we can talk more about his 2017 tax law, but I think unfortunately this proposal just cuts in the opposite direction of all the things that made his 2017 tax form really successful.
Kim, I have to second Kate here. It seems like this is an idea that would narrow the tax base, which is the opposite of what economists say you want. You want low rates that are applied evenly to a broad base of income without a lot of carve-outs. And that was the direction that the 2017 tax cuts went. And this would be a move in the opposite direction. I do worry, as Kate says, that it would create incentives for companies and workers to structure their income as tips. And so things that are not generally thought of as tipped jobs right now, maybe your plumber, your tree guy, the guy who mows your lawn, there would be an incentive to get as much of that money that is being paid right now just as a fee for the service. There'd be an incentive to transform that into tips, which I think would be economically pretty destructive. And then I agree also that this looks like such a clear effort at a vote buying scheme. Donald Trump is talking about, until the election, every time you tip on a receipt at a restaurant, you should write vote for Donald Trump because he will make these tips tax free. It is right up there, I think, with the efforts of President Biden to forgive student loans, for example, and try to keep the younger voters with student loans who are getting basically free money from the government, keep them enthused on the road to November. It is about as clear as you can be about what's going on here without saying something more specific like, let's just make income of workers in Arizona and Michigan and Wisconsin tax-free.
Yeah, I will third Kate and you. One of the problems economically here is that when you talk about this risk of people restructuring income, restructuring the way their businesses are operated so that maybe more income is calculated as tips or more industries are engaging in paying their workers through tips, you end up with unintended consequences. And we have a really good example of that having happened a few years ago in Kansas when it did a similar carve out. And what it decided to do was zero out income taxes for certain pass-through organizations. And unsurprisingly, businesses rushed to take advantage and reorganize themselves. And Kansas ended up experiencing this significant revenue shortfall. And what it did is discredit overall tax reform. And that is one of the things that I worry about Donald Trump doing here. I think the 2017 tax cut was one of the highlights of his administration. It resulted in all of the good economic benefits that people were talking about so much, at least prior to the COVID mess. Low unemployment, a lot of capital flowing back to the United States when we decided to go to a largely territorial tax regime. And we put somewhat of an end to those inversions, and instead hundreds of billions of dollars came back here. We lowered both personal and corporate tax rates, but we broadened the corporate tax base, and that's what you call good economic reforms that are good for people and good for the economy overall, not just one group of them. That's what he should be trying to be building on here, using the coming expiration of many of those provisions as a reason to argue for a very sweeping and broad-based, further wide tax reform. Instead, I feel like what you see happening in both political parties is, instead of conversations, which used to be so prevalent in Washington, about how you have good economic reforms in terms of taxes, now all we do is talk about taxes in political terms. So whether that is Joe Biden talking about green energy tax credits, which are all aimed at shoring up a certain kind of voter, or whether it's the bipartisan rush at the moment to hand out more and more money for child tax credits because everybody wants to take credit for that. This Trump and the tipping tax promise is just another example, as Kate said, of targeting a very specific voting group here and putting your name to the top of a tax goodie for them, even though it could be very damaging, not just, like I said, to immediate the income coming in, but also to the broader cause of significant and smart tax reform.
Hang tight. We'll be right back in a moment. Welcome back. Let's turn to another idea that is getting some attention from both sides of the aisle, and that is the corporate tax rate. As a reminder, the 2017 tax reform lowered the corporate rate from 35% to today's 21%. President Trump, in a meeting with corporate executives recently, reportedly told them he would like to go one notch, 1 point lower to a 20% rate. And you can compare that to the budget that was proposed by President Biden, which would raise it 7 points from 21 to 28%. Kate, how do you score these ideas from these two candidates?
Well, so the corporate tax cut that Trump got through in 2017 was permanent, and Republicans worked hard to make it permanent. And by that, I mean, It doesn't expire at the end of 2025, the way a lot of changes to the individual income taxes you and I pay expires at the end of 2025. And the reason why Republicans in Congress in particular worked to make that corporate rate permanent was because temporary tax changes would not have driven the kind of capital return to the United States that a permanent policy would. They really wanted to make structural reform to U.S. competitiveness. And that also, because economists think that there is a fair degree of the corporate tax that falls directly on labor, I mean, this was also a really good reform for workers. The U.S. at the time was quite an outlier at 35% and even up towards 39% when you add in state corporate levies. So this was really the crowning achievement of Trump's tax reform. And I do think he's floated 15% before. I do think that he could try to negotiate a lower rate. Now, what I would say on Biden, too, is in addition to it being a more punishing rate at 28%, and that I don't think you would get, the budget office will say you'll get significantly more revenue from that. But given the higher rate, I'm not sure that that's true. I would just add to that Republicans in Congress, if they reopen this debate when it's a permanent tax change, they will have a lot of folks who want to raise the corporate tax rate one more point to get in their pet idea. At the end of 2017 tax reform, you had lawmakers who said, I want to go to 21. It was supposed to be 20. We ended up at 21. I want to go to 21 or 22 to get in more changes to the child tax credit. These are the kinds of things where the rate could easily creep up really quickly and undermine that achievement of the 2017 reform. So I think that there is a real stark difference between what Biden and Trump are proposing on the corporate rate. And the hope should be that Trump starts to organize more of his tax policy around ideas like I described that are structurally change the incentives to invest and work and move away from these diversions like stuffing tips away from the IRS.
Two things I would add to that. One is that it's important to understand that while the cut from 35% to 21% was a big improvement, it's important to understand how that compares around the world. And according to the Tax Foundation, a recent analysis on corporate tax rates around the world, the U.S. is still slightly above average. And that's important because of competitiveness around the globe, other countries that are cutting their tax rates to try to keep up, but also because, as Kate explains, we have two layers of this corporate taxation because many states add their own corporate levies on top of the federal 21%. So according to the Tax Foundation, the U.S. is the 84th highest corporate tax rate in the world, combined and federal state rate of 25.77. And the average weighted by GDP around the globe is 25.67. In Europe, it's 24.49. And some pretty low rates in pretty appealing countries, 12.5% in Ireland, Kim. And so I think that is one thing that you have to keep in mind is even though the cut from 35 to 21 was a big improvement, part of what that did was make up for how bad the corporate tax system in the United States was before.
Yes. I mean, there are still those of us who argue for zero. Now, we're not getting a lot of attention, but 21% is still very high. And I think that this is really important, this point about state taxation and its addition to federal taxation. As we talk about Biden's proposal, people need to really grasp the magnitude. When he says he wants 28%, and by the way, let's be honest, that is sort of a starting point for Democrats. There were Republicans who wanted to see more of their priorities and just couldn't bear the idea of supposedly giving up that much more revenue, wanted to bring it up another point or two. Democrats are going to take 28 as their opening position. And if they ever got a chance to really run this again, they'd be advocating that it be more like 30, 31, 32, higher. Then you add in those state and local levies, which push it up further still. And suddenly we're looking at a United States that's at the very bottom of all the tax rankings, especially when you look at, I know you quoted those averages, Kyle, for European countries, OECD countries, but those are just the averages. We have, different competitors out there that have corporate tax rates that are 10%, 12%, 15%. Asia in particular has a pretty low regional average for taxation. These are our competitors out there as we're selling goods and products, and also as we are encouraging companies to find a home base for where they want to keep their money and invest their money. And so I think that this is a really, really notable distinction between Trump and Biden that Trump really needs to grab a hold of and hammer home and make some even bolder promises about how he's going to double down on his achievement in the first time around and lower that corporate tax rate even further.